Don't you just love it when class is finally over and you can go home and watch some anime before doing your homework like the good procrastinator you are? And then you start randomly watching a show that you previously hated and had dropped a while ago, but you were so exceptionally bored that you decided to complete it anyway. And then you actually ended up liking it?
I think that's just you.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, this is gonna be a video defending the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th episodes of the Asterisk War. Oh no, I said something they didn't like! Episode 22 opens with Ulis asking the group what they're doing over winter break, completely disregarding their plans, and dragging them to her home country, through both kind of a funny transition and a horrible looking CGI plane. On the way to Ulis' castle, the group's greeted by a huge parade celebrating Ulis' victory in the festa, and since Iato was her partner, he's become a celebrity too! When they arrive at the palace, Ulis derides her brother Yulbert, the king of Lysseltania, for throwing the parade without her permission. The visuals also tell us that Saya is bothered by Iato and Ulis' camaraderie. Yulbert mentions how he has many things to discuss with Iato and Ulis, and that there will be a welcome banquet later that night. Next, the group leaves and begins to talk about the history of Lysseltania. It is explained that the country became a puppet state, and is controlled by the Integrated Enterprise Foundation, and that control maintains a financial disparity. Ulis explains that this state of inequality is why she wanted to win the festa in the first place. The sequence ends with Claudia finishing a mysterious call that she clearly seems upset about. There isn't much to the first 6.5 minutes of this episode beyond setup, but its only real flaw is that some of the future payoffs are made a little too obvious. For instance, Yulbert clearly doesn't look like the king of a country, or even really act like one, so the viewer can clearly infer that something's not quite right here. Saya is also clearly bothered by how close Iato and Ulis have become, which on first viewing I would attribute to Saya just being Saya because this is the Asterisk War. It's all her character is, so yeah, we'll just get to that when we get to that. Next, the fact that Ulis is a princess and her brother the king wants to speak with her and Iato about something smells like marriage to me, since wish fulfillment and all that. I do like how Ulis gets some characterization though. Regardless of being a very typical tsundere, she was always a relatively consistent character, and her motivations actually create comprehensible world building, which was something this show desperately needed at this point. I know that this sounds like I'm praising the Asterisk War for doing the bare minimum since, well, even the worst pieces of entertainment have setups and payoffs, but what's interesting about all three of these setups is that the Asterisk War is finally letting some characters that aren't Iato breathe. I think it was a wise choice to further develop the backstories of the girls surrounding Iato so that the characters that were arguably wish fulfillment props in the first and most of the second season actually feel a little more human than before. Sure, the fact that everything revolves around Iato is still extremely contrived and unrealistic, since this is the Asterisk War, but I'd rather have a show that fleshes out what revolves around the all-powerful MC-kun than a show that wants you to take every character trait for granted, and hence treat its characters without any sort of respect. It is a shame that it took the Asterisk War 22 episodes to get to this point, though. Anyway, the episode continues with Flora telling Iato that dinner's about to start, but that Saya is nowhere to be found. Iato agrees to go look for her, finding her on the roof, despondent. The two have a heart-to-heart featuring Saya apologizing to Iato about failing to keep in touch with him after she moved away because it was too painful for her to continue. Saya puts particular emphasis on never being there for Iato when he lost his sister, believing that she may have been able to help him through this very difficult part of his life. She concludes by telling Iato that she wants him to rely on her whenever he needs to, because she'll be there, because she doesn't want to abandon him again. Iato promises that he will, and the two head back. Remember how I said earlier that I thought the show was going in the right direction by focusing on characters that aren't Iato? Well, this is the first instance of that happening, and it really took me off guard when I first watched it. I had initially thought that given the show's nature, this conversation would not contain any real emotion or any sort of confession, and Saya would just be like, "Oh, everything's fine, I'm just jealous of you and Ulis, but I'm not going to say that out loud." And then in response, Iato would just be really dense and no progress would be made at all. But the show didn't take that route. Instead of copping out, the Asterisk War actually took the time to flesh out Saya's character by giving her a deeper motivation than petty jealousy. The fact that Saya stopped talking to Iato because maintaining their friendship over a long distance was painful for her provides a good justification for why the two didn't communicate with each other until now. This also strengthens their relationship as a whole, implying that the two must have been incredibly close friends before she moved away. I also think Saya's guilt over not helping Iato makes her feel more like a human being who's capable of making and regretting her mistakes and wants to improve herself, instead of a tacked on childhood friend archetype. I think it's also worth noting that the aesthetics of the scene are also very nice. I really like the deep blues and it really sells the seriousness of the situation. This isn't to say that this reveal doesn't have problems though. The scene could have used much more foreshadowing than it received. While I do think you could argue that Saya's obnoxious behavior in previous episodes does foreshadow her desire to be there for Iato, that doesn't change the fact that Saya's apparently been hiding her guilt ever since their reunion in the first episode, and the show could have taken more time to prepare us for this new breakthrough. Additionally, it does really bother me that Iato doesn't share his perspective of the friendship or even look all that bothered. There's no discussion of how Iato could have felt bitter about Saya's lack of communication, because that would imply that the all-powerful MC-kun is flawed. And in response to Saya's profession of guilt, he just blandly reassures her that he'll rely on her in the future. That is such a weak response to a strong expression of guilt, and it's an unfortunate result of the show's nature. After all, if the MC-kun isn't flawless and perfect in every way and able to help all the girls with their problems, then what kind of MC-kun is he? Even with these flaws, I wanted to focus on this scene because it is a step in the right direction. The very idea that Saya's motivation to help Iato isn't just because she's romantically attracted to him makes her feel more like an independent agent in the narrative instead of a prop that's being pulled around by a genre where romantic attraction is a given. And it's not like I'm trying to prove the Asterisk War is perfect, I'm just trying to argue that these episodes are an improvement over what we've gotten before. So it gets points from me for actually trying and succeeding to build character for once, at least to some extent. After that, Claudia invites the group to be her teammates in the Grips Festa, and it's implied that Ulis being on the team is problematic for her. They then set up opponents for the next Festa that blah 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 blah, who cares? Everyone agrees to participate, so it doesn't matter. Next begins the party, and wow, this show just jumped from a 1 to a 10 real fast. Oh yeah. Actually, Claudia's dress is really pretty, so like, holy crap, it's a great shade of purple. I want to wear it so badly, you have no idea. Anyway. At the party, some focus is put on Yolbert as Ulis explains to Iato that he's basically a puppet that runs the puppet state without really caring about his job, which is why the Integrated Enterprise Foundation treasures him. It is also explained that Claudia's father is the head of this region as a member of the foundation, and Claudia's mother is an executive. The two separate, and this shot indicates that something menacing related to Claudia is about to happen, which it does after a stupid scene in which Iato saves Kirin from a group of people and tells her she's beautiful, and they link arms because this is the Asterisk War. Saya interferes and also links arms with him because this is the Asterisk War. A guy randomly shows up and attacks them with his summoned monster since they agree to fight in the gyps with Claudia, and a fight scene ensues. Saya blasts one of the monsters out of the party, reminding Iato that she's there for him, and then Iato, Ulis, and Saya kill it. The guy threatens to come back and the episode ends. I don't think there's much to elaborate on, since basically everything here is payoff for the setups discussed earlier. The fight scene itself is cool, with decent animation and music, though despite the characters' handicaps of not having readily available weapons because of the party, the tension is killed because of how overpowered they all are. Overall, while not without its problems, this episode was definitely an improvement, and was a good primer for the series' strongest episode yet. Before I delve into some more plot summary, because you all love hearing me summarize the plot, I'd like to address the overall aesthetics of this new episode because they are strikingly different from what's been presented to us previously. To elaborate, the bright and garish pastel colors have been drastically muted, the lighting is harsher and much more stark, and everything looks more gray and intense. This creates a solidly ominous atmosphere, making every conversation, plot point, and character feel much more weighty than before. Since the episode deals with heavier backstories and plot points, points, it makes sense that they would make this type of change. Even on a more subjective level, I actually quite like this shift. I never enjoyed the pastel aesthetic of the show to begin with, since it's really fake and candy-like even for typical anime, so the toning down was a welcome change. Okay, back to the plot. In episode 23, the random assailant from the last episode is identified as a man named Gustav, an internationally wanted terrorist who appears to be carrying out a big organization's request. The group all passed on police protection because not relying on the authorities is kind of a dumb running theme in the show, so it's not worth questioning. Claudia leaves to do some research in a rather well-framed shot. The shading out of her eyes and her melancholy demeanor invoke a feeling of mystery. Then Yolbert asks Iato and Ulis to stay behind and talk, and asks Iato if he wants to marry Ulis because this is the Asterisk War. He states that if she doesn't marry Iato, Ulis will end up married to someone convenient for the Integrated Enterprise Foundation anyway, so she should just pick someone she likes while she can. The decision is ultimately left up to Iato because this is the Asterisk War, and of course that's how these things go. Don't pay attention to the subtitles I intentionally decided to put in. Hold on, this can't be real. This can't be right. This isn't real. I thought this was the Asterisk War. You can't have something like that in a show like this. Well, we all know where this is heading. Okay. I'm good now. Don't worry. Sorry. I was a little shocked there, but yeah, that's genuinely how I felt when I watched this scene for the first time, since it was an actually good, solid scene that I genuinely liked. Sure, there are moments I liked every now and then previously in the show, particularly the song sequence in episode 19, but that didn't change the fact that this show was still garbage, and I previously expected nothing out of it, so the decent character development and neat subversion of tired tropes in this scene pleasantly surprised me. It finally felt like the anime was trying to tell its own story instead of working from the most basic magical high school anime template imaginable. To go more in depth, I was firstly surprised by how this forced marriage trope was handled, particularly because many other shows of this caliber botch it horribly. Usually the girl is forced into marriage with someone else and the main character has to stop it Graduate style, or it's treated like an end goal for one of the girls to obtain so long as the main character is the one they're marrying. The decision over who gets to possess the main girl is always left up to external forces, and the girls involved, regardless of how strong and independent they previously were, are forced to sit back and hope the main character actually does something productive for once. Essentially, this turns characters into either a helpless victim or a shallow dunce who has to compete for the protagonist's affections. It can lead to good drama if done correctly, but most of the time it's just a thin veil for wish fulfillment, which just takes me and whoever doesn't fantasize about this sort of thing out of the experience. And just to be clear, if your fantasy is to break girls out of forced marriages or have a bunch of them fight over you, honestly, all the power to you. I don't really hold anything against you, but it's just not for me. At first, the Asterisk War seems to be going for the archetypal version of this trope. Yolbert treats Ulis getting married like an inevitability, therefore robbing her of making any real decision on the matter, and gives all the decision-making power to Iato. While Iato responds how I expected him to, that is, denying the marriage because that would end all the best girl wars in this particular series, the diegetic reason for why he denied it really caught me off guard. He explicitly states that this marriage would force Ulis to do something she clearly doesn't want to do, which is wrong because while limitations in life are unavoidable, he believes people should have some power over which limitations hold them back. He also states that he doesn't want to be a burden to Ulis in any way, unless she actually does want to marry him, in which case he chickens out and doesn't give much of a concrete answer, granted. I never said the scene was perfect, you know. Iato could stand to make some more decisions for himself, in my opinion. Sure, you can reasonably argue that this decision was written this way to keep the guessing game of who Iato will end up with going, but the entire bit about Iato wanting Ulis to make her own decision about marriage is a smaller detail detail that isn't actually necessary to achieve that goal. So I do think the show is intentionally subverting expectations here. Furthermore, this interaction actually helps develop Iato's character, which is something that the show desperately needed. He's always been an honorable guy, I guess, but his main narrative purpose is to be an overpowered blank slate that the viewer can project themselves onto. Hence, he can be really boring to watch and hard to relate to as a person. He has no real motivations beyond saving his sister, and has arguably the least autonomy out of everyone in the cast. All he does is get dragged around into the girls' stories to help them with their problems, because him having any issues of his own would interfere with his self-insert nature. He's basically just a passive character that does nothing unless told otherwise. To draw from a previous example, remember how during Saya's confession he doesn't really respond to her in a way that might imply he's flawed or opinionated? Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Essentially, he never really gets an opportunity to define himself as a person, and I find it hard to relate to a character that doesn't play an active role in his own story. Well, unless there's a good reason for the main character's passivity, like their mental hangups prevent them from being active or something, like Shinji Ikari from Eva. In this scene, though, Iato shares his opinion and is motivated to protect his friend, eschewing all the indecisive crap that defines characters like him. Not to mention the actual decision he makes shows that he genuinely cares about Ulis and wants to help her however he can, even if it doesn't necessarily benefit him. To be clear, this is not amazing or original characterization, but it still serves the purpose of making Iato more relatable and likable. Moving on, the scene just kinda continues with Yulbert accepting the decision, and then he asks Ulis to not compete in the Grips Festa, since any future popularity of hers might drive him into irrelevance. Ulis declines and leaves. Yulbert explains to Iato that her participation would exacerbate relations with the Integrated Enterprise Foundation, and thinks this will lead to her suffering. Yulbert then asks Iato to try persuading her otherwise, which he declines, and Yulbert just kind of accepts that and discloses Ulis' potential location to him. Then we see Claudia talking to the newspaper boy from earlier, in case you forgot that character, which is entirely reasonable. Claudia looks despondent during this conversation, and the sequence ends. I guess now's a good time to talk a little bit about what I like about Claudia's incorporation into the story. It's not like phenomenal or unique foreshadowing, but there's enough subtlety here that it actually builds up intrigue over Claudia's connection to Gustav, since she seems to be the only one who recognized him previously and is working behind the scenes to find out why. It helps add weight to Claudia and Ulis' participation in the Grips Festa before we actually understand why Claudia wants to partake, which is a nice touch. Following the Claudia scene, Iato finds Ulis at the orphanage she used to go to as a child. She's seen having an adorable and wholesome snowball fight with the young children, which is interrupted when one kid notices Iato. As it turns out, Ulysses was expecting him to follow her, and the two go talk to the sisters who run the orphanage. You see Ulis talk with them and act less defensive than usual, which is a nice change of pace. The other nuns leave, and the pair talk with Sister Therese about the orphanage. Iato points out a greenhouse, and the visuals indicate that it's a place Ulis associates with sorrow, showing how she used to be close to a girl who frequented the greenhouse until something tragic happened to her. Iato follows Ulis outside, and she states that saving the orphanage was like curing a small symptom to a larger disease, in which case the symptom is just the orphanage's bad state, and the disease is just the overall state of the country, in case you didn't get that metaphor. Anyway, that's why she's participating in the Grips Festa. Then a car passes by with a familiar face, and she runs after it, followed by a very confused Iato. What I like about this sequence is that it further elaborates on Ulis' backstory and how attached she is to the orphanage. When she interacts with the children and sisters there, she seems much more relaxed and carefree than how she's previously been presented. In basically every other scene, she's always rather on edge, standoffish, serious, and cold, even more so than your typical tsundere. Even when she warms up to Iato and the other girls in the show, she's never quite as relaxed and carefree as she is in this orphanage, which says quite a lot. This implies that Ulis deeply values her experiences in the people in the orphanage, because it's a place absent of rivals, politics, stressors, and other important issues that continually plague her life. Furthermore, the orphanage, a place that she loves, also allowed her to interact with the misfortunate in her country, and thus fostered her desire to help them. Ultimately, this scene does a good job of reinforcing Ulis' character motivations, and thus gives the audience more reason to root for the team to win the Grips Festa later down the line. After that, the two find themselves far outside the city, making their way through a blizzard and treading on rotten ground. They find the girl that caught Ulis' eye in the car before, who's revealed to be Ophelia. The two girls begin fighting, and Ophelia begs Ulis to stop, which Ulis refuses, leading to her defeat. Ophelia then tells Iato to leave, which he doesn't do, so they fight with Ulis and Iato's arms. Like I said before, this show is not perfect. Anyway, apparently Ophelia's power emits this gas-like thing called miasma that weakens her opponents, and she nearly gets Iato when... Oh, come on! No! I tried to defend you, and you go and come out on me!
Come on, Asterix War, don't do this to me!
I'm making an entire half-hour show! No! Basically, Gustave shows up, Ophelia stops and leaves because she wasn't supposed to go outside anyway, letting Gustave do whatever he wants. He tries to kill Iato, but is stopped by Claudia. Iato then passes out and the episode ends. Beyond the stupid cop-out ending, which I will talk about later because it pisses me off, this was a pretty solid fight. Ophelia is established to be a pretty significant threat, since she way too easily takes out Ulis and even makes Iato stumble. The music is tense, utilizing high-pitched violins excellently, and the way Ophelia's power is brought to life through the sickly purples and chaotic animation is fantastic. The guy behind this is Hokuto Sakiyama, who specializes in sketchy animation that constantly moves and can be quite disorienting. His unwieldy style is far separated from the clean, polished nature of typical modern anime, so seeing cuts from him is rather rare nowadays. He actually animated a cut earlier in the Asterisk War, which had an interesting effect. I think it was supposed to represent Iato's incomprehensible power, but his style unfortunately clashed with the show's aesthetic. In this scene, on the other hand, it really works because he applied his style to the powers, not necessarily the characters. It makes Ophelia's powers look intimidating, unnatural, and hard to control at the same time, and heavily contrasts the clean nature of every other power we've seen previously. The sound effects also help bring her power to life, giving it a simultaneously eerie but powerful quality. This makes sense since, as we learn later, Ophelia is a manufactured Genicella, a normal human who is experimented upon by scientists. As a result, she's incredibly powerful but very damaged, which is expertly portrayed by her facial expressions, character design, and the voice acting by Sakamoto Maya. It's a real shame that this is the only episode Ophelia plays a major role in, because he's immediately a far more interesting character than most that have appeared before. However, yeah, the cop-out ending really hurts the scene overall. In fact, it may be the single most contrived thing this show has featured so far because of the ridiculous level of plot armor and convenience. Gustave shows up at literally the most convenient time he could have showed up, breaking up a moment of good tension. And the head of the rival school just so happens to call Ophelia about her absence at about the same time and leaves. Then Claudia also happens to show up at the most convenient time possible to save Iato from being killed, because he just happens to be luckier than Domino from Deadpool 2. Anyway, the Asterisk War clearly wanted to make Ophelia seem like a real threat, but her power is so damaging and overpowered that it could potentially kill the protagonist before they throw down in the real fight you know is coming later in the story. The show just kinda wrote itself into a corner by accident and got out of that corner in the laziest way possible. It's even more disappointing because the show actually does a good job establishing Ophelia's presence, so these terrible writing decisions threw a good portion of the episode's goodwill in the garbage. Even including that overwhelmingly negative aspect though, I'd still say the episode did more right than wrong. Sure, it's not like amazing, deep, or complex, and has a lot of problems, but it's like okay popcorn entertainment, which, just to reiterate, is like 100 times better than what I was expecting. And for the most part, the next episode continues to be okay popcorn entertainment, though it's definitely the weakest out of the three. Episode 24 opens with a nightmare sequence, recapping the previous fight and waking up an incapacitated Iato. He notices that Saya and Kirin are sleeping on his bed because, well, you know by now. Ulis enters the room, informing him that he's been sleeping for 3 days and that everyone was worried about him. The two then discuss Ulis' relationship with Ophelia. Apparently, she was the girl who sewed Ulis' handkerchief that caused her such memorable trouble in the first episode, and was the girl that frequented the greenhouse that was discussed earlier. The two were very close friends until Ophelia was taken by the Integrated Enterprise Foundation as collateral for the orphanage's debt. She was then experimented upon by a student from a rival school, which is how she became a manufactured than Estella to begin with. Ulis had tried to convince her to come back before, and Ophelia said she would, only if Ulis is able to defeat her, which is nigh impossible given what we just saw and what happened in the past. This backstory is fairly predictable if you paid any attention to the previous episode. It's not that big a stretch to connect Ulis' sadness to her sudden recognition of and subsequent fight with Ophelia. In fact, all this backstory does is make me wish Ulis or Ophelia were the protagonists of this story. The issue with Iato being the protagonist, despite the obvious, is that his story is not clearly associated with the world building. His main motivation is just to rescue his sister, which is very basic and can be applied to any setting, at least not in this point in the show. If in the future we learn that his story is more unique to this setting, then this criticism is definitely invalid. But at this point, it is definitely not. But Ulysses and Ophelia's is. Ulyss's motivation is inherently tied to fixing her country, and Ophelia's character is a victim of that cruel and unjust society that Ulis wants to fix. If the show focused more on these characters, then we could have been able to learn more about the problems of the setting and what motivates the characters to fix them in more depth. This is where the Asterisk War actually shows some potential for thematic exploration, but it's held back because it just continues to play it safe. Moving on, after that, Saya and Kirin wake up and they discuss the current Gustav scenario. Flora bursts in and yells about how dragons are now suddenly flying over the city, forcing the police to abandon the orphanage. Reading between the lines, the group decides to go fight him under Ulyss's rules. They confront him and he summons a huge Hydra, which Iato has to fight by himself because this is the Asterisk War. And actually, let's go on a tangent to talk about the reasons why this fight is pretty cool. I've complained about Iato being overpowered in the past, but I'd rather an overpowered character fight a huge dragon creature than a bunch of nobodies in a tournament. The animation on this fight is also rather nice. I love me some pretty hand-drawn explosions, and the spectacle of Iato running on and past the buildings is legitimately good stuff. I also like how Iato has to cooperate with the other characters here. It gives them a reason to participate in the fight and shows off how well they work together. You get payoff for Saya's character arc, and you even get a pretty cool scene from Kirin as she takes out Gustav by herself. Granted, the fight could stand to create the illusion of weight a little bit more, but overall it's pretty fun. After that, Claudia talks with her father about her decision to participate in the Gripsfesta. We learn that her family had been trying to pressure her to not participate and used Gustav to try fully convincing her. In the end, she ends up sticking to her decision to participate despite her father's foreboding advice. And, well, after all the good build-up in these past 3 episodes, this is the perfect payoff. The fact that Claudia kept to her ideals this entire time and worked behind the scenes to try and protect her friends, even when so much was at stake for her, strongly shows off her conviction, stubbornness, and strength as a person. Those are genuinely solid and likable traits, and as someone who used to despise Claudia, I'm glad that these episodes convinced me to like her to some extent. We finally saw a different, fully developed side to this painfully annoying and flirtatious student council president. So, congrats, Asterisk War. You got me to like a character I previously hated. You get a gold star, I guess. The next day, before the group departs, Ulis declares that she will win the Gripsfesta to Yolbert and asks for his help. He comments on how much she's changed because of her friends and blah 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 cheesiness. He agrees to help. Ayato gets a call informing him that his sister has been found and is being housed in a hospital. Apparently, she's been in a state of death for 5 years, and Ayato deduces that she's used her own power on herself for protection. And I'm very relieved that this show finally moved forward with its protagonist's story. Like, this is the final episode, and it's only now that something relevant to Ayato's motivation really happens. It's a baby step. We still don't officially know that the guy with the weird beard is the guy who forced Ayato's sister into this state, but it's a baby step nonetheless. But that is some horrible pacing. Jeez. Moving on, Iato is then approached by... Oh, please no. Stop. Stop! Anyway, she's the mad scientist girl who experimented on Ophelia earlier and claims that she can cure Ayato's sister. Then we suddenly cut to the group back together as Claudia apologizes for all the trouble her father caused everyone. The group confirms their desire to participate in the Gripsfesta, and the episode ends begging you to buy the light novel to find out what happens next. Well, it doesn't literally do that, but that's the painfully obvious subtext. These events are terribly rushed and the editing is horrible. Nothing is given any time to feel naturally integrated into the narrative, and it genuinely feels like whiplash when the show moves from the scientist scene to the group scene. Also, introducing a new character this late into the show, like literally in the last 5 minutes, is exceptionally dumb. It's very clear that the show was just advertising the light novels at this point, and the transparency makes everything extremely inconsequential. I don't care about the mad scientist character, I don't really care about the Grips Festa, and I don't care about all these new plot threads since no season 3 has been announced, and I don't want to waste money on the books. It's a bad ending, and I want it to feel bad for being just an advertisement. Though, arguably that's what the show was to begin with. That's what a good portion of anime are, after all, advertisements for the source material. But the show could have been much less transparent about that fact. Like I said earlier, this episode is definitely the weakest of the 3. The only solid parts were the fight with the Hydra and the resolution to Claudia's arc. Everything else just showed off the show's wasted potential or teased at things that will likely never be animated. It wasn't offensively bad or anything, like we didn't get any bad cop-outs like in the last episode, but it did kill a good portion of my investment in the transpiring events. So, in the end, these episodes were decent, I guess. Not great, but watchable. If the Asterisk War had been more like this, I don't think anyone would have really cared about it, except it wasn't like this. Instead, it was mostly really, really bad. Bad enough that it became kind of a meme when people cared about it, and Anitubers made long videos dissecting why it was terrible. So, now that no one really cares about the Asterisk War anymore, why would I waste my time making this video in the first place? When I first watched the Asterisk War, I absolutely despised it and cited that it was everything wrong with modern anime. I made fun of it on Twitter, made videos mocking it, and generally agreed with all the criticism levied at it. So I went into these new episodes expecting the absolute worst, but that wasn't what I got. Rather than being boring, aimless, and horribly incompetent, they were relatively weighty, contained good if somewhat shallow character exploration, established consequential in-universe politics, and had fun action at times. They're still heavily flawed and don't come close to redeeming the show, but they do begin fixing some of my major problems with the story, which is something I can appreciate at least. Or maybe my standards have just heavily decreased since 2016, that's entirely possible. But even if that's the case, I still found my shift in opinion kind of interesting, and thought that it would be worth sharing considering how negative the discourse around the show is. Anyway, the Asterisk War, it's not a good show. I still think I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but it did show me that anime I previously deemed trash still have the potential to prove me wrong later down the line, and I think that's a valuable experience to have. And for that, I thank it.
In the shadow where you lay, in the darkness I be playing one by one. In